Okay, so now we jump into our gospel passage, which comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 2. So this is one of those instances during the special season of Lent and Easter, where we're going to hear not from our synoptic gospel that we hear during the year, Mark, but instead we're going to hear from the Gospel of John. It's John chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. This is the famous scene that's called the cleansing of the temple. Let's read it. Since the Passover of the Jews was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as money changers seated there. He made a whip out of cords and drove them all out of the temple area with the sheep and oxen, and spilled the coins of the money changers, and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves he said, "Take these out of here, and stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples recalled the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house will consume me." At this the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the Scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. While he was in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, many began to believe in his name, when they saw the signs he was doing. But Jesus would not trust himself to them because he knew them all, and did not need anyone to testify about human nature. He himself understood it well. Okay, this is good. Okay, the cleansing of the temple. So this, in the Gospel of John, the scene that is recorded comes right after the wedding feast at Cana, which is right at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. The wedding feast at Cana, it says, was the first of the signs that Jesus did. But even that was, in some ways, a private sign because at this wedding reception. So Jesus, we could wonder, maybe he hasn't even come into the public arena quite yet. I mean, maybe he has, but that's the point. Is actually it's at the beginning where things are a little bit less clear. Whereas in the other Gospels, the cleansing of the temple is recorded later on, as time has gone by. So this actually, I've read a couple of different ideas that some people say, well, it's the same event that's taken place and they're just putting it in a different place to emphasize something different. Other people suggest, well, maybe he actually cleansed the temple a couple of times. Like maybe he went and did it once and they didn't really get it, so then he had to go and do it again. We don't really know. What we do know is that each gospel records it one time. And maybe it's not even every gospel. I should have looked at that. But those gospels that have it, it's just in there one time, and this one, it just happens to be at the beginning. Okay, now, what is the temple? The temple is the place of sacrificial worship. So Solomon builds a temple, Solomon, the son of King David, and so the next king after David, he builds this temple. It's a glorious temple with the golden cherubim, and they put in the Holy of Holies, and they see the glory cloud of the Lord descend in the temple, and it's this grand and marvelous thing where the priests can offer worship and offer sacrifices and all those really great things. After a few years, so maybe about 300 years or so, what happens? The temple is destroyed, because the Babylonians come in from the south and they invade the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and they conquer them, destroy them. They ultimately destroy the temple, which is sad and tragic. Like, this is the very place where God dwells. When they bring the Ark of God into the Holy of Holies and they see the glory cloud of the Lord go into the Holy of Holies, it's like, okay, this is incredible. This is the place on earth where God dwells among his people. And then when the temple is destroyed, the Bible tells us they see this image of the cloud ascending back up into heaven. In other words, God has left because his people have been rebellious and they have abandoned him. So now the Lord abandons his people, at least as far as his living presence on earth goes. They are able to return later on in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They rebuild the temple, but even as they rebuild the temple, there's a few people that saw both Solomon's temple and this new temple. And the people who have seen both, they weep because they recognize that the new temple pales in comparison to the old temple. It's still for God, but they don't see the glory cloud descend in. It's not as nice as Solomon's temple. And then later on down the road, when Herod the Great comes along, he's the one who was the king during the time of Jesus' birth. When he comes along, he decides he wants to try to convince the people that he is the Messiah. And so he does what he can to build up the temple so that it becomes a really truly marvelous thing, that it becomes something that, I mean, we know in the Gospels that people, when Jesus is with them, people will say, look at this, what marvelous stones. So he builds it up into something of like a great wonder, we could say. So anyways, that's what's going on. This is the temple that we're talking about. So when it says actually that this temple has been under construction for 46 years, they're talking about how Herod the Great began this construction to rebuild the temple, or not so much rebuild it, but to make it fancy, to build it up. And it took 46 years, which goes beyond even Herod's life. But anyway, now it's like that's where the 46 years comes into play. Okay, so that's what the temple area is. So it's the place of sacrificial worship. Even though they don't have the physical sign of God's presence there, they don't have the ark anymore, they don't have the glory cloud of God's presence, they still have the Holy of Holies, which is like empty, but still the people know that this is the place where I offer sacrificial worship, where if I want to go to the place where God lives on earth, I go to the temple. And the priest, the high priest, one time each year would go into the Holy of Holies to offer sacrificial worship there on the altar. So that's what it is. So now, what does it say? Since the Passover of the Jews was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So this was something that took place yearly, that it was required actually, I think 3 times it was required, that the men of Israel, maybe all the people, but for sure the men of Israel were required to go into Jerusalem to the temple to offer a sacrifice. They would have to come from all over the area. So they would make pilgrimage. In fact, one author I read said that something like 1 million people would come into Jerusalem to offer this sacrificial worship for their ritual that they did each year, or 3 times each year. So anyways, that's a lot of people. And you can imagine some of these people traveled a long ways, and they had to sacrifice animals when they got there, and not just any animals, but like for Passover, you had to offer a lamb that was without blemish. And so there was actually written into the system that they didn't have to travel with their animals, but they could come to the temple and they could buy animals there. So, some people will hear this scene and they'll say, okay, well, Jesus is picking on them for selling the animals. But that's actually not it. Like that was a legitimate thing that they were providing for the people, actually, of like making it so, look, you just got to come to Jerusalem. You don't have to bring your animals. You don't have to care for your animals on the way. You just got to come. And when you come, you can buy some animals so that you can have animals that are without blemish, animals that are fit for offering to God. And then you can go into the temple with these animals and offer those to God. So it doesn't seem like that's the case, that Jesus would be really upset that they're selling these animals, because it was actually a service for them. One biblical scholar that I check out, he suggests that the problem is more location. What does it say that they are? He found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as money changers seated there. In the temple area, what does that mean? Well, the temple area had multiple different areas for people to be. There was, of course, the Holy of Holies that only one person can go. Then there was like the main body of the temple, we could say, where the Jewish people could go, but the Gentile people, the pagans, could not go there, because this was for God's chosen people. But then on the outside of the temple area, they had what was called the court of the Gentiles, this area where Gentiles could go who believed in God, who feared God, and so they could go and offer worship to God from the court of the Gentiles, from this outer area. And so this guy was suggesting that the money changers are in this outer area. So they've made the place where the Gentiles are allowed to worship God, they've made that place a marketplace. They've made it like Walmart, kind of. It's like, so that's the question. If you imagine going into Walmart, especially like a busy Walmart, do you think you'd be able to pray there? Do you think you'd be able to worship God there? Gosh, I don't know. It would take a lot of concentration, so that's the idea, is that Jesus wasn't so upset that they were buying and selling, but actually he was upset that they were buying and selling in the place where Gentiles were, because they couldn't go in further to the temple. And if you think about it, like Jesus came to save not just the Jewish people. Of course he came to save the Jewish people, but he came to save the whole world. And so of course it makes sense that he wants to draw also the Gentiles to himself. And so if the Gentiles don't have a place near the temple where they can offer worship to God, that's going to make him upset. So it seems like Jesus would be suggesting, in a very strong way, of course, with the whip of cords and that kind of thing, that he's suggesting, like, look, go sell your animals someplace else, so that the Gentiles can have a place where they can worship in peace and quiet. And this, I think, gosh, there's something about this. I've been on a kick lately with my homilies, the last couple of homilies, where I've just been talking to my people about, like, look, when we're in the church, we got to let it be a place of prayer, not to let it be a social hall, not to let it be a place where we catch up with each other, or, whatever, we're really casual, but instead to let it be a place of silent prayer, where we can offer worship and prayer to God, because that's what the temple is meant to be. And when we don't allow it to be that, well, we find out what happens to Jesus when we don't allow it to be that. It says that zeal for your house will consume me, and it causes him to cause a ruckus. This quote from Psalm 69, zeal for your house will consume me. What is zeal? Zeal is like a dramatic increase of energy for a particular cause. Like I'm zealous for this. I'm so energized by it that I get angry if things don't turn out the way that I think they should. And of course, what Jesus thinks should turn out is exactly the way that things should turn out, because he's Jesus. He knows what's up. And so like for him to say like, okay, I'm zealous for this, and so I'm gonna kick you out, right? Like that's the thing. Then we should listen to him. We should let it be a house of worship for all the people. And so the Jews, when we hear the Jews, we got to understand it's not necessarily like all Jewish people. So the Jews, again, this Bible scholar was telling me that the Jews are like the people from Judea, the Judeans, the people who live in Jerusalem specifically. So we're talking about like the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those who are in charge of the temple worship. So Jesus is talking to these people specifically, and these people are responding by saying, okay, what sign can you do? In other words, what great miracle can you perform to prove that what you're doing is actually appropriate or legitimate right now? Never mind the fact that he was doing something. Again, if it was just like that he was trying to prepare a place for the Gentiles to offer worship, like that's something that should have been expected in the law. So there shouldn't be a sign that's necessary. But as it is, they're insisting on it. Like, what sign can you do? And we're actually going to see this actually repeated by Paul in our second reading when we jump into our second reading. Anyway, so what sign can you do? And so Jesus says, what? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then they say, well, this temple's been under construction for 46 years, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days? But Jesus was speaking about what? The temple of his body. Now remember, what is the temple? The temple is the place of sacrificial worship, the place where God lives on earth. Well, who is Jesus? Jesus is the Son of the living God who has come to do what? To sacrifice himself for the salvation of the world. So Jesus, of course, is speaking about the temple of his body, which, of course, is at the beginning of John. So later on, like 17 chapters from now, Jesus, the living presence of God on earth, wherever he is where God is on earth. So Jesus, the living presence of God on earth, will sacrifice himself in sacrificial worship to the Father. Like that's what he's talking about. And then he'll be placed in a tomb. And then 3 days later, what's going to happen? He'll rise from the dead. So he's prophesying about something. Because Jesus, after all, is a priest, a prophet, and a king. And so here he is prophesying about the reality of what his life is going to be, which is the Paschal mystery. His life, death, resurrection, and then eventually, of course, his ascension into heaven, where the sacrifice being completed, Jesus will return to the Father in heaven. And so when he said this, or when he was raised from the dead then, so now John is like jumping ahead, like, okay, so now when he was raised from the dead, his disciples realized like, oh my gosh, this is what he was talking about. Which again is like a sign that we see throughout the Gospels regularly, is that his disciples, they hear him preaching, they hear him teaching, but they just don't always get it. Sometimes they get it, but whenever he's talking about his death and his resurrection, they just like never get it. They never understand. In fact, even when they see it, it's just like, we didn't see that coming, that kind of thing. And so now John is saying after hindsight. So it's like if you're reading the gospel as though trying to figure out what's going to happen to Jesus, John is already giving you a hint of like, okay, well, when he was raised from the dead, then they understood that this is what he was talking about. They believed that the scripture, they believed that what Jesus had spoken was true. That's incredible. Now we have these last couple of lines here. So while he was in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, many began to believe in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. So he did perform miracles. He just didn't perform the miracle that these people were looking for in this minute. But we know that throughout the Gospels, Jesus performs lots of miracles. And because of these miracles, because of these wonders that he performs, many people come to believe him. But Jesus would not trust himself to them because he knew them all and did not need anyone to testify about human nature. He himself understood it well. In other words, he didn't need anyone to prove that human nature is prone toward rebellion, prone toward like not understanding, prone towards sinfulness and rejection. He's like, no, I understand this, and so I'm not actually going to fully entrust myself to anybody because I know that that's not what I've come to do. I've come to give my life as a ransom for many. That's what I've come to do, and so that's what I'm going to be about. This is Jesus. Incredible. So one last note, I think, about this Passover. When does Passover take place? So every year Passover takes place in the spring. Right around the spring equinox, which would be like late March or into April. Well, what are we doing here during the season of Lent? We are preparing for Easter. And when is Easter? Well, if Jesus celebrated Passover right before he was arrested and died and was buried, then when is Easter going to be? It is going to be right around the time of Passover. So I think that's kind of a cool thing, is like Jesus was here going to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and here we are just a few short weeks away from the Passover that our Jewish ancestors will still celebrate this year, and that we ourselves will celebrate with the new Passover, which is the Paschal mystery, ultimately culminating in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Whew, man, what a gift that we get to participate in this mystery. There's something about just like entering into the story as though we're hearing it for the first time, and that's just so beautiful to enter in. And I'm glad to share it with you, because this time of Bible study it's just so fruitful. It bears fruit in my life. I hope it bears fruit in your life as well. I'll see you for the next session for when we get into Paul's reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. God bless you.